Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 16 of Love Field Stories, presented by Dallas Love Field Airport. I'm Bruce Bleakley, aviation consultant, historian, and co author of The Love Evolution, a centennial celebration of Love Field Airport and its art. And with me today is Harriet Baskas, brilliant writer of all things travel, who has been featured on USA Today, NBC News, CNBC, and others. Her blog, stuckattheairport.com, is an in-depth guide to airports and airport amenities. So if you've ever been stuck at an airport, or if you're stuck at one right now, she's probably written about that airport on her blog. And she describes herself as happiest in an airport or unusual museum. Is that an accurate description?
Definitely. It's kind of like my happy place. Unusual museums, just because you learn about weird things. Like I just learned recently that we've got a rubber chicken museum here in Seattle. Who wouldn't be excited and happy to do that? But airports also, because it's that idea of going somewhere or having an adventure that's unfolded, not folded yet.
Well, in a past life, I was the museum director at the Frontiers of Flight Museum, which, by the way, is at the southeast corner of Love Field Airport. So we'll have to bring you out to that museum sometime. Yeah. But now today, we're going to talk about the history of Love Field and tips that everyone can benefit from during their upcoming summer travel. But before we do that, I think our audience would like to know about your blog, Stuck at the Airport. Can you tell us why it exists and what people can expect when they visit?
Sure. A long time ago, when I was doing a lot of traveling to visit unusual museums around the country, I found myself literally stuck at an airport for 8 hours one day. And we didn't have the internet then, and I couldn't just spend the time on my phone. So after about hour 4, I just started opening doors and found, after 4 hours, after I'd looked at the 3 airplane models several times, that there was like a kind of looked like what we would call a lounge now, that had nicer chairs and a place where you could look out on a nice view from the airport that I had missed in the first 4 hours. And so by the time I got home from Kentucky to Seattle at 1 a.m, I woke my husband up and said, there needs to be a guide to everything to do in airports. And he said that was the stupidest thing he ever heard, and that's why I do it. But there was no guide. There was no guides. There was no internet that you could look on. So I started doing that.
Well, good. That's great. And this sounds like a really great time to talk about how to relearn how to travel and what to expect nowadays at airports.
Yeah, I had to do this. And you feel a little silly if you're a frequent traveler having to relearn travel, but I had to do that. I had to take out my cosmetic kit, my travel kit of things, and refresh everything. Everything had dried out. I had used some of the stuff that was in there. I had to, a new toothbrush, some toothpaste, things like that. So I think we need to relearn those skills. We also need to, the traveling I have done, I've noticed people behind me and even myself, we forget like what you can and cannot put in your bag. So there was before, but there's so many people now who forget that they have a water bottle in their carry-on kit. There's a lot of people who forget that they have their gun in their carry-on bag or in their purse. Things like that. And just those types of things about traveling, and just the patience that you need when you go to the airport. There's so many of us, again, people are anxious anyway, but so many people haven't traveled in so long. There's a little bit of a more like higher anxiety right now. What are we going to expect? What it's going to be like? And so you just need to bring that patience when you go to the airport a little more. And airports are just busier than we expect. People are traveling, so it's going to be harder to find a parking spot. You're going to have to leave earlier to get to the airport, things like that.
True. Okay. Well, and I think it's an interesting idea about exploring at an airport and things. For instance, even at Love Field, there's a lot of things to explore, and some of those things which talk about the history of the airport.
I'm so excited to be on this podcast with you because I have your book, and you can see that it's all sticky noted. So I have a million things I want to ask you about.
Well, one thing I should probably explain, first of all, the title, The Love Evolution.
Yes.
I and the other three authors who did the part of the book about the art at the airport we're trying to figure out what's a good title for this book. I know it might sound a little strange, but when the airport was undergoing a big modernization program some time back that lasted about 8-9 years, they decided to brand it as The Love Evolution, taking the first four letters of evolution as a palindrome to LOVE, love. And so we said, okay, that's as good as any. That kind of tells the story.
But it also makes me think, or might make people think, that the airport does have some sort of history with love. But that's not why it's named that, right?
well, it has nothing to do with the emotion love, but with the person. The airport was started in World War I as a training field for Army aviators, and it was their tradition at the time, when they established a new flying field, to name it after an Army aviator who had perished in the line of duty. And so the next name up on the list was Lieutenant Moss Lee Love, who was from a prominent family in Fairfax County, Virginia, and incidentally, a great nephew of President James Buchanan. And so that's how it came to be called Love Field. Of course, people have kind of capitalized, especially one particular airline has capitalized on that name, but that's where the name comes from. And so that's how it started.
Well, that makes sense, because when we think about like some other, like O'Hare Airport, also named after someone lost in duty. So
yeah, and the military part, of course, didn't last very long. Once Love Field, once World War I was over, the Army left Love Field pretty much in early 1919, gradually and totally gone by 1921, and it was used for barnstorming and the very beginnings of civilian aviation. And then the airlines came in and started flying, first just a few flights in the 20s, and then in the 30s they really built up a new terminal in 1940, and then a big buildup in World War II when the Air Transport Command used Love Field for its largest base in the United States. And then after World War II, of course, a huge increase in interest and demand for commercial flying, and we got a second runway and a new terminal which is the site of the current terminal back in the late 50s and up to what we have today. So yeah, there's a very rich history to this airport.
So one of the things I read in your book, and one thing I'm interested in at all airports, is observation decks. And it seems like your airport had one at one point.
We did, and as a matter of fact, people in the late 1950s, there was an observation deck, well, even in the 40s, in the late 50s and into the 60s, there was an observation deck at the terminal, and it was from that observation deck that in 1959 that people could watch Lady Bird Johnson push the ceremonial button to start the engine, the first engine on a Boeing 707 that began the first Boeing 707 service. That was with American Airlines out of Love Field. They had just arrived from New York, and then they had passengers get off. They had some more passengers get on. They turned right around, went back to New York. So that was one of the little interesting events that happened. Unfortunately, we don't have the observation deck as such anymore, but in the new terminal, on the passenger concourse, there are large floor-to-ceiling plate glass windows all along both sides, north and south of that concourse, where you can look out onto the ramp area and see the airplanes parked there.
Was it an open air observation deck?
No, there's no open air observation deck. But
was the old one an open air?
Must have been. The old one was an open air observation.
Yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we can't have those very much anymore.
That's kind
great.
of
yeah.
So
you also had in that, I guess, first terminal, I want to call it the old terminal, but the first terminal, your airport, I know because I've done research on moving walkways, was the first airport to have moving walkways, or
That's right.
Building sidewalks. Yeah.
The moving walkway had been invented some time before, but Love Field was the first one to have a moving walkway. In from the main section of the terminal building to the three different concourses, west, north, and east, out to the first set of gates in each concourse.
And was it because it was just cool to have moving walkways, or it was really a long way?
Well, the concourses were long, very long concourses. We had, at that time, the early 60s, Love Field had 32 gates. And so there were three very long concourses, and that enabled people to, it gave them a little bit easier trip out to at least the beginning of each concourse. But the new concourse, the new redesigned concourse, as part of the Love Field modernization program, is compact enough with only 20 gates. We really don't need the moving walkways there.
Well, I love the pictures of people on the moving walkways in the old days. One, they're all dressed up like people used to be dressed. But I understand, like, people were, I don't know, it was controversial or dangerous.
Well, they had some teething problems with the first walkways, especially with women's high heels. And as you exited or got on or got off of the moving walkway, and sometimes an extra long dress or something like that. So they had to go back and do some redesign. And then for a time, they actually had attendants there for a while to make sure everything was going okay. And they smoothed out all the problems. So.
And now when you go on a moving walkway, it's funny, a lot of us only go on moving walkways at airports. You hear that announcement, maybe that replaces the attendant. The moving walkway is now ending. Yeah. So watch your step and things like that.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of cool because it speaks to the fact that airports were still in the 50s. People were in early 60s. Not everyone flew. It wasn't such a thing. It was like an everyday thing. Right. And so even it was where you went to see new things. You had a new experience, not only flying, but in the airport, which is still how it is now.
It is.
There's new things. Then what happened?
Well, we do have moving walkways now, but we don't need them in the terminal building anymore. But since Love Field's passenger service has expanded so much in the intervening years, we've built more two new parking garages, B and C. Parking garage A is right next to the terminal, but B and C are a little bit further out, and there are moving walkways from the ends of those parking garages to the beginning of the parking garage, or to the part closest to the terminal building. And still, from the farthest parking space you can find, it takes you a maximum of 8 minutes to get to the terminal. So.
Great. Well, I'm glad they still have some moving walkways.
Yes, they
just
do.
So that you hold that history of that spot.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah. So I also know that at some point, Love Field didn't have a lot of traffic, and that the terminal was used for a roller rink or a skating rink.
Well,
what was that?
Yes, and once Dallas-Fort Worth International, what is now Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, opened in 1974, all the major airlines moved out to DFW Airport, and that was part of the agreement that they had made. And only Southwest, as a local carrier, which wasn't flying hardly at all, comparatively speaking, in those days, was still left, plus a couple of flights here and there with smaller commuter carriers. And so there really wasn't much going on in the terminal building. It was kind of a big empty space. And so it was leased for a short time, a little more than a year, really, by a company that did an entertainment center, or an entertainment arcade. It had a roller rink, an ice skating rink, a movie arcade, some other amusements here and there. And as I said, it lasted a little over a year, and it was called the Love, LLOVE, entertainment complex. But then in the mid 70s, and that was 1974, 75, but by about 1976 and 77, the airlines, with some restrictions, started flying again out of Love Field, short-haul airlines, and most notably Southwest Airlines, who did not want to move to Dallas-Fort Worth International. And so the traffic got there were more and more people, and gradually the Love Entertainment Complex went away.
That's too bad. It'd be great if they could have kept some of that. But there
Interesting.
I do know also that there was a thing where some airports, again, because they were almost like community service, there was libraries at some airports, and you mentioned movie theaters. It was a place to go, fancy restaurants on the outside that people would go to have dinner before somebody left. So I love that they had those amenities. But I want to go back to the 1960s then, because so many people go to Dallas now, and they go, I don't know if you'd call it presidential tourism, but I'm interested, and I didn't realize until I read your book that, or thought about the fact that John F. Kennedy came in 1960, we know about what happened when he left, and Lyndon Johnson, or a little bit of that. And I want to hear about the role of the airport in that day.
Well, that was a big day for Love Field, certainly. And as a matter of fact, President Kennedy was the first president to fly into Love Field on November the 22nd, 1963.
That's like forgotten, yeah.
And Vice President Johnson preceded him in Air Force Two, as was the protocol at that time. Whenever the president and the vice president go to the same destination, of course, they never travel on the same airplane. But the protocol is that the vice president arrives first so he can welcome the president. So Johnson was here first, and then Air Force One landed with President Kennedy. And then the two aircraft, Air Force One and Air Force Two, were parked on the tarmac for a while the motorcade was taking them to where President Kennedy was going to give his luncheon speech, and of course never made it. Once the word got, flashed around that the president had been shot and had been pronounced dead, and everybody reconvened back at the two aircraft, and President Kennedy's body in a bronze casket was brought out to Air Force One. Also, they had to actually take out a segment of a bulkhead in order to fit the casket in through the entrance door. But and then it was on board Air Force One, parked on the tarmac at Love Field, that Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as the 36th president. And it was an interesting day of firsts. He was the first president sworn in the state of Texas, first president ever sworn in aboard an airplane, and the first president sworn in by a lady, or a female judge. Justice Sarah T. Hughes was a personal friend of the Johnson family, and the Johnsons knew that she was going to be in Dallas that day, and they found her, and they were able to get her out to swear in the president on board Air Force One.
So is there, do people know that? I feel like, do you have to be old to remember that? But do people know that history, and is there a physical remembrance at the airport of that?
Yes, actually, there is. There is a bronze plaque that was donated to the airport by a friend of mine that is a former FBI agent and a very astute and knowledgeable expert on the JFK assassination. In fact, he's an expert witness on the subject in court. And he's quite a collector, but he also put together a beautiful bronze plaque outlining the sequence of events on that day, from the time the president arrived till the time Air Force One departed with Lyndon Johnson aboard and President Kennedy's body. And that bronze plaque is inlaid in the tarmac at the spot where Air Force One was parked on November the 22nd, 1963. There is a viewing area on the second level of the terminal building, out a plate glass window where you can look out onto the tarmac. Of course, you can't go out there because it's on the secure side of the airport, but you can go out to the tarmac, or you can look out on the tarmac and see where the plaque is. And to show you where the plaque is, there's a white light embedded in the tarmac itself. that's visible from that window. And then to help people understand the situation a little bit better, to the right, as you stand looking at that window, to your right is a duplicate of that bronze plaque, along with another placard that tells the story of the events of that day, and a presidential seal, all donated by this gentleman, who's quite as I said, who's quite an expert on the history of the JFK assassination. So we, as far as the history of Love Field, yes, the president's assassination and the events surrounding it were tragic events. We concentrate on the historical impact and the importance of Love Field's part in the story of the president, the new president being inaugurated there at Love Field on board Air Force One.
So what's that man's name? And didn't you say he was actually in the airport the day that happened as a kid?
Yes, he was, as a matter of fact. And he had gone out along with the crowd with his mom to see the president arrive and wave at him and everything like that. So, yes, he'd been there as a young boy.
So there's a connection. And did you say his name? Are we allowed to say?
It's Ferris Rookstool III.
Okay.
And as I said, he's quite an expert on the whole subject matter and quite a collector of things related to the president.
So was that complicated, or was it a debate to have that plaque put in there because it's a sad day?
Well, again, it was a significant day. Yes, it was a sad day, but it's something that happened. It's part of history, and it is also part of. It's memorialized on one of the 3 Texas state historical markers that talk about the airport as well. And so, yeah, it's it's a significant part of Love Field history. So it's not something that you can just kind of not mention. So and to that end, then we kind of tried to make sure that the public's well informed on, just what happened on that day.
So would it be good to bring binoculars to go and
Yes.
when I come there and look out at that? Yeah.
Yes. Even with binoculars, you won't be able to read the plaque that's embedded in the tarmac, but you will be able to read the one that's on the wall to your right without the binoculars.
That's great. So I always think, like, I live in Seattle and there's no plaque, nothing that memorializes or marks the fact that the first or the only unsolved hijacking stopped in Seattle. So there's nothing about DB Cooper here. They want to talk about that. So I'm glad that you're right. It's significant to the history. The airport played a significant role in the history of that day.
Well, and as I said, that story is memorialized also outside the terminal building. There's an area called the Danny Bruce Flag Plaza. Excuse me. Danny Bruce was was a director of aviation here at Dallas Love Field Airport. Well, director of aviation for the whole city, actually, in the 1990s, and he did a great job, and that's why they named this Flag Plaza after him. But at that Flag Plaza, there are also all 3 Texas state historical markers related to Love Field. The first one relates to the beginnings of commercial aviation and the fact that commercial aviation and airmail service started at Love Field for the whole state of Texas in 1926. And then the second one tells the story and commemorates Love Field as the site of President Johnson's inauguration. And the third one, which is the most recent from 2008, celebrates the importance of Love Field to the overall transportation makeup of the North Texas area and its part in development of transportation systems and air travel in particular. So there's a lot of, again, the history is a big thing here. So
is that a spot where people could go and sit and picnic or something?
You could, well, not really picnic, but there is the flags, the 3 historical markers, and then there's an obelisk that commemorates the Lieutenant Love and the 12 airmen that died during training accidents during World War I, when this was an Army training field. And so, and by the way, for a flying training operation that lasted about a year and a half, to have only 12 fatal accidents in that amount of time, given the dangerous nature of flight training in those days, is kind of phenomenal. So that in itself is pretty interesting. But those are things that are all together. All that history lesson for Love Field is all together in that one place. But you had mentioned that you thought that at the Seattle airport you didn't have plaques or things like that commemorating significant events. But as I understand, you've written a book about things you must not miss.
Yes.
When you visit Seattle, and I know I don't have the title right. Can you tell us about that?
Oh, so I have a guidebook coming out to Seattle, 111 places in Seattle you must not miss. It's part of an international series. I'm not sure if there's one for Dallas, but there might, or there should be. But it's interesting because I had to argue, I guess, with the editor. I definitely wanted to have something in there about our airport, but I also wanted to have something in there about King County Airport. And there's so much Boeing history in Seattle. I had to really convince an editor who doesn't live here that all that history was really important, that people would want to know where the first Boeing airplane flew from, and people would want to know where some secret art is in the airport and things like that. But before we end our first half hour, I want to ask one more history question.
Okay,
because you mentioned the 20s. I know so many airports or so many cities were urged to make a commercial airport because when Charles Lindbergh did his went around the country, and I wondered if he came to Love Field in the 20s there.
Oh yes, he did.
Yeah.
After in the late summer and fall, after he got back from Paris, from his nonstop flight from New York to Paris, he took the Spirit of St. Louis on a tour of all 48 states. And he tried to land at as many places as he could, just so that people could get a chance to see the airplane. And he didn't want to promote himself that much. He wanted to promote aviation, and he wanted to show people, it was safe and it was developing, and it was going to be something, an important part of their lives. And it had that effect. People were absolutely electrified by what he did. But that tour was an important part of that too, that made the general public all over the United States more air-minded. He tried to stop at most major cities in each state, and when he came to Love Field, it was as a matter of fact, September the 27th, 1927. They decided, the city leadership decided, let's use that event as a reason to go ahead and dedicate Love Field as Dallas's official municipal airport, which is what they did.
Great. So many cities. That was the impetus to go forward with commercial aviation. Mm-hmm. I do know, I think from a long time ago, that when he went to Albany, I think it was the Albany airport, not only were people happy to see him, but somebody stole his laundry.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that.
Souvenirs, yeah.
Well, we're like we you're right. There's so many interesting stories, and there are more interesting stories that we haven't touched on yet about Love Field that I think we're going to cover in our second follow-on episode to this one. So for right now, I'm going to say thank you, Harriet, for being with us and filling us in on. Oh, by the way, that book about 111 things you must not miss in Seattle. That's not your first book. As a matter of fact, you've written one called Stuck at the Airport, right?
Yes.
So,
yes.
Okay. So, so the creator of StuckAtTheAirport.com, Harriet, thanks for being with us for this first episode of Love Field Stories on the history of Love Field Airport.
Great. We'll see you soon.
Okay. We'll see you soon.